Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's meeting with the Workers' Party of Britain. Tonight's meeting, Solidarity with Yemen, marking the Global Day of Action against the conflict in Yemen. I'll now pass over to the Deputy of the Workers' Party, Jyoti Brar.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thank you all of you for joining us tonight for this really very vitally important meeting, actually, and a very exciting lineup of speakers we've got on this topic. Very quickly, by way of an introduction, I just wanted to make a few points about Yemen that are not generally explained in our mainstream media. In general, the media, the imperialist media, the corporate media, they ignore the question of Yemen. But when they do talk about it, they recite a few facts, and these are the facts that everybody knows, that Yemen is the poorest country in Africa and Arabia, that in the Middle East, that Yemen is suffering from a huge humanitarian crisis. But what they never do is put any of that in context. It's as if Yemenis were always poor victims, that they were somehow born to need our charity. And that is how Yemen is presented, as a charity case. So what is Yemen and why is it being targeted? I think it's worth asking ourselves. You know, the short answer is that Yemen is a vital strategic location. And it's a country that's attempting to have an independent government while occupying this vital strategic location. And that's the short answer to why is Yemen being targeted. You know, Yemen occupies the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. It's bordered by Saudi Arabia in the north and Oman in the northeast. And at the southernmost tip, it's just a few miles from the coast of Africa, very close to Djibouti, to Eritrea, to Somalia. And the small channel that runs between the southern tip of Yemen and the coast of Eritrea is the southern entrance to the Red Sea. That's the Bab el-Mandab Strait. It's a vital geostrategic shipping lane linking Asia to Europe via the Suez Canal at the northern end. And this is a point on the map that imperialism is very keen to hold on to, has worked very hard to cling on to during the days of empire, and still harbors a desire to control. And beside that, it's an area that the Saudis, who are one of imperialism's chief proxies in the Middle East, also have desires to control. The country occupies about 200,000 square miles. That's more than twice the size of Britain, but its population is just around 26.5 million people. That's just over 1/3 of the population of Britain. So it's much less densely populated than we are, but it's a decent size of territory. And it was the landing place of our ancestors when they left Africa. And it's the home to a great many sites of importance for understanding human prehistory. And it's also, being close to where agriculture developed in Eurasia, Yemen was also home to some of the first great human civilizations, with complex social organization, flowering of the arts, of science, of engineering. All the great kingdoms of southern Arabia in the ancient world were located in modern day Yemen. So it has a rich cultural, architectural, and artistic history, which is never acknowledged or talked about in the West, in our media. How many people do you bump into on the streets of Britain who would know the first thing about any of that? But of course, it's a history that the Yemenis are very aware of. In fact, the whole of the Middle East knows about Yemen. It has a stature in the Middle East because of its ancient history and culture and its vibrant political traditions. You know, I'm not going to talk more about that, but it's something that we should be aware of, how important it is, and also aware that the Saudi bombing campaign has been targeting and raising much of this ancient civilization and culture. And that in itself is a criminal act. That what there is to learn about human history and prehistory in Yemen is substantial, and what has been destroyed can never be replaced. And then, of course, as a strategic location, you know, it's been of interest to empire for hundreds of years. The British were not the first, but they were the longest occupiers of Yemen. First it was the Portuguese, then the Ottomans. The British naval fleet docked there during the Napoleonic Wars, and then the East India Company took control when they realized that it was a really important staging post on the way guarding the sea lanes to India, India being, of course, the most important colonial possession of the British Empire. for some 200 years. And then with the development of the Suez Canal, Yemen developed another importance as guarding the entrance into the Red Sea that links you up to the Suez Canal. So before we knew about the oil in the Middle East, the British interest was focused on the passage to India. But of course, it still is a vital shipping lane, the key link between Asia and Europe, vital for energy supplies, very important for the running of modern imperialism. But after oil was discovered, Yemen acquired, of course, a new significance to the British Empire. And they really wanted to hold on to that for all of those reasons. It was, in fact, fierce independence wars waged by the Yemenis that kicked the British out during the 1960s, first of the North and then of the South. The South, in fact, was a socialist republic for some 20-something years, until the collapse of the USSR, when it was reabsorbed and the two Yemens were reunited. So Yemen's had a pivotal role in Arab politics. You know, it might be the poorest country in the Arab world, as we're always being told, but as a country with an ancient history and a vibrant political tradition, you know, it's always been respected and looked up to. And in fact, many of the leading Saudi families actually come from Yemen. Saudi Arabia always wanted to control the whole of the peninsula, and that's become really quite obsessive since the rise of Crown Prince MBS to the leadership of Saudi Arabia. And on the other hand, there's a real fear amongst both the imperialists and their proxies in the region, Israel in particular, and Saudi Arabia, of an independent Yemen, because an independent Yemen is going to be aligned to the axis of resistance in the Middle East against imperialism, against Saudi Arabia, against Israel, for the popular masses, which, you know, is terrifying, frankly, to the imperialists and to their proxies. So we can understand a little more, I hope, from that, why Yemen is targeted and what Yemen actually is. You know, it's not just some poor bit of desert. It's a very important and a very historic place. I'm not going to talk anymore right now. I want to lead you straight into our first speaker. He is a former British soldier, now a Workers' Party member and activist. And we're very happy to have him on the platform tonight, in particular because we in the Workers' Party really believe that it's vitally important that we recognise that our armed forces are by and large workers in uniform, that they must come to understand that they are part of the working class, that they must learn not to identify with the people who set the culture in the armed forces, who direct them into these criminal wars. They must be helped to organise to resist involvement in these criminal wars, but that takes organisation. So I'm going to hand you over now to Ruben. He wasn't unfortunately able to be with us live, and so he sent us a recorded message.
I'm a former soldier, but today I would say that I'm both a socialist and an anti-imperialist. But the reason I joined is that simple. I mean, you know, there were the childhood things, you know, being a hero and all that sort of kid stuff, sort of. But more than anything, it was just to get away from drugs and poverty and all that sort of working class estate life, right? And I believe, not only do I believe, but I know through my interactions and my experience in the military that it's a very similar situation for other servicemen too. Most lads in the army, and they're good lads, they join to get away from poverty. And I would also say that British servicemen, British soldiers, they are not to blame for the wars that they fight. And today's so-called left really need to listen to that and understand it. Ultimately, the responsibility of the criminal wars lies with those who send them. That is the British state. I would also say, and I would also add on this occasion, that it's absolutely shameful that the British Army today is partner to the atrocities and the terrorism being carried out by the Saudi regime. British-made bombs dropped in Yemen every day, dropped by British-made warplanes, flown by British-trained Saudi pilots. And we know this because both American and British ordnance has been found at precision hit sites. So precise because of the British intelligence and the reconnaissance provided by British forces. And the sites that are hit in most wars, they're not only military. They are not only military. They are homes. They are schools. They are factories, power plants, you know, infrastructure, roads, the necessary infrastructure for any society to function and for people to live a decent and dignified life. All gone, blown to bits. Now, unfortunately, our ruling class and the British state has a history of endangering our countrymen and therefore wasting billions upon billions of British taxpayer money on these the criminal destruction of other countries. And it's all done under the guise of democracy. Time and time and time again, our media cheer these things on, right? And our politicians find a way, they always find a way to justify the unjustifiable. Libya, Iraq, Syria, they are just 3 of the latest criminal adventures that, again, our British state has wasted billions of taxpayer money upon. All at a time, you know, it's not only during the COVID crisis that the NHS has been under incredible strain and been in a crisis. Many years before the COVID pandemic, every winter the NHS has been in an absolute crisis for lack of beds, for lack of all sorts of equipment. Now it's a very serious lack of ventilators, nurses and doctors, but we've always had a lack of beds, nurses and doctors. So whether people agree or not with the reasons for destroying entire nations and therefore directly or indirectly murdering, because that has been the very real measured result of it, as well as the destruction of the infrastructure, you know, many thousands of innocent women, children dead, blown to bits. And there is one matter, absolutely one matter, that should concern all British citizens, soldiers, both serving and ex-servicemen, and that is the repercussions of the actions of the British state. These all affect us all directly. So the so-called moderate rebels, you know, the head-chopping suicide bombers that they turned out to be, those in Libya, that were funded, that we funded, our state, that our media had cheered on, you know, white helmets as well, you know, all done in the name of Libya's destruction. These were the same moderate rebels that later came to British soil and bombed Manchester, killing British citizens, women, men, children, brothers, sisters, etc. If we hadn't bombed Libyan, Syrian, Iraqi, Yemeni, innocent women and children, then radical Islamists, you know, the likes of Daesh, ISIS, to name a few, they wouldn't then have grievances which they exploit to carry out their own ends. But also, since the illegal war in Iraq, we wouldn't have radicalized scores, thousands of moderate, you know, rebels, extremists, essentially, who then go on to join and bolster the ranks of ISIS and Daesh. Therefore, it's the responsibility of all British workers to challenge both the media and the British state on Yemen and all the other atrocities past, current, and no doubt future carried out by our British state. As for our servicemen, speaking as an ex-serviceman, you know, we should absolutely applaud the resistance of the courageous and heroic Lance Corporal Ahmed al-Babati, who said, and I quote, "I've seen enough not to speak out, and I would rather sleep peacefully in a cell than stay silent for a paycheck." That's what he says, and that's what he's done. Lance Corporal al-Babati, he serves as an example of the very best that the British Army can produce, and he has served his country and its workers by bringing to light the shameful collusion of the British state and its armed forces in Yemen by refusing to be party to that, whether directly or indirectly. I wish brother and comrade al-Babati all the best, and I call on all workers, servicemen and ex-servicemen to show him as much support as possible, the same support, if not more, that we have shown Julian Assange, who is also a courageous hero of our time. Non-cooperation with war crimes in every walk of civilian and military life can and will win peace and put an end to the barbarism of the ruling class. Do not wait on the Labour Party or any other politician, Labour or Tory, to do this. They will never do it, ever. Workers and servicemen, we are the ones that will bring peace.
A wonderful message there from Ruben, and a reminder that it is we in the working class who have the power to allow wars to be waged or not. And if we refuse to allow them to be waged, they cannot be waged. This is a message that the anti-war movement is desperate not to bring. The so-called anti-war movement is desperate not to bring to the workers this understanding of their power, their ability to stop the wars dead in their tracks if they get organized and use that power. And Ahmed al-Babati, absolutely, Lance Corporal, has been a shining example of that. And I look forward to the day when we have armed forces made up of people like Lance Corporal al-Babati and like Ruben Lawrence. Just quickly before we move on to the next speaker, I wanted to remind everybody, we are streaming this meeting on as many platforms as possible. Right now, it's going out on George Galloway's platforms, on the Workers' Party platforms. We also asked the Communist Party to host these, and we're asking, in fact, our audience, anybody out there who has Facebook, YouTube, Twitter accounts, if they're happy for us to use them when we broadcast these meetings, get in touch and let us know. You will know, and if you don't know, you should know, that left-wing voices, independent voices, non-corporate voices are being targeted by social media. On the one hand, we're told it's a wonderful flowering of democracy, the advent of social media. On the other hand, we're seeing how the social media has been monopolized, and the ability to speak is cut off to many people, sometimes by algorithms, sometimes by manipulation, sometimes by just attacks that stop your stream. So if you're watching a stream tonight that goes down, please switch to one of the others. You can see us on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter. As I mentioned, on all three of those accounts, whether it's Communist Party, Workers' Party, George Galloway, hopefully at least some of those will stay running throughout this meeting. But as I said, get in touch if you are happy to stream our meetings in the future, because we want to use as many avenues as possible to make sure that our message gets out there. Our next speaker is Jay Tharapal. He's an anti-imperialist activist. He works with the Yemen Solidarity Council, and we're very grateful to him for getting out of bed at an earthly hour, because right now he's in Sydney and it's something horrendous like 4 in the morning over there. So Jay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you to the Workers' Party of Britain for putting on this event in solidarity with the people of Yemen. It's a great honor to be among you all. Yemen should be making headline news every single day for the sheer brutality being inflicted upon its people. But instead, the war is not only ignored by the corporate media, but also subject to big tech censorship of the type that Jyoti mentioned. So our website, yemensolidarity.org, is banned on Facebook, by the way. The reason for this media blackout, however, is extremely easy to understand. There is no conceivable humanitarian pretext to justify the war on Yemen, and any public discussion about Yemen would soon lead millions of people around the world to ask the question, why are the richest and most powerful states on earth inflicting collective punishment on a nation of 27 million people that even prior to the conflict was one of the poorest nations on earth, and a nation that relied prior to the conflict on imports for 90% of its food? There is no humanitarian pretext for why the Saudis and Emiratis have recruited over 100,000 mercenaries from the poorest countries in the world to fight in Yemen. There is no humanitarian pretext for why the Anglo-American powers, that is the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia in particular, have all contributed towards training the Saudi Navy to enforce this genocidal blockade on the Yemeni people. And there is no humanitarian pretext for why arms industries across the world have profited from selling billions of dollars worth of deadly equipment that are being used against the Yemeni people. The Saudis spend around $200 million per day committing this genocide. So this is not a David versus Goliath conflict. This is a David versus 1,000 Goliaths conflict. And when this conflict ends, it's highly likely that the final death toll will be counted not in the hundreds of thousands, but in the millions. So despite these incredible odds, and despite the weapon of mass starvation being employed against them, the Yemeni national resistance is winning. And this is very, very inspirational. So it's important to know their story. So what do I mean by the Yemeni national resistance? I'm talking, of course, about the National Salvation Government of Yemen, based in the capital Sana'a, which represents a coalition of political movements, most importantly Ansarullah, which is also known as the Houthi movement. On the odd occasion that you do see Yemen being covered in the media, they frame the conflict by saying that the US-Saudi alliance is helping the so-called legitimate government of Yemen defeat the so-called Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. But this framing is completely absurd. The president of this so-called legitimate government resigned from office before the war began. He then traveled to Saudi Arabia, claiming he was still the president of Yemen and that Saudi Arabia was acting on his behalf. 2 years later, the Saudis placed him under house arrest, and we haven't heard a word from him since. This framing is absurd because around 83% of the fighting force of the so-called official government of Yemen is comprised of foreign mercenaries, whereas the Yemeni national resistance, led by the Ansarullah movement, is 100% comprised of Yemenis, and it's referred to, despite this, it's referred to as being Iranian-backed, as if there's something foreign about them. The reason for this absurd framing is legality, the legality embodied in UN Resolution 2216, which was passed in April 2015. This resolution was co-sponsored by the US, Britain, and France. Russia and China could have vetoed this resolution, but they chose not to, thereby contributing to the legalization of the war on Yemen in the eyes of the UN Security Council, unfortunately. And that really shows that what's legal isn't always moral, and that which is moral isn't always legal. So Yemen has been resisting imperialism since the 17th century, when the armies of the Ottoman Empire invaded because they wanted to occupy Yemen for its strategic position as the naval gateway to India and the trading networks of the Indian Ocean more broadly. After the Ottomans were defeated in World War I, the British Empire started arming and funding the Saudis to invade Yemen in 1934. The plan was that Britain would control South Yemen, which it had controlled since the 19th century. And the plan was that the British would help the Saudis to invade and conquer North Yemen. But that plan failed because of the resistance of the Yemeni people. The Yemenis beat back the Saudi invasion force, and in South Yemen, the people kicked out the British and established a Marxist-Leninist republic which became, South Yemen. So fast forward to the 1970s, North Yemen has a modernizing Arab nationalist president called Ibrahim al-Hamdi. And he continues to be deeply respected in Yemen today. But in 1977, he was assassinated, and this was a tragedy. We now know that the Saudis were responsible because they wanted to keep Yemen weak and divided. And that's a major part of the story. The assassination paved the way, that is the assassination of Ibrahim al-Hamdi, paved the way for the 34-year reign of Ali Abdullah Saleh. And on his watch, Yemen was transformed into a virtual colony of Saudi Arabia. And it was transformed into a colony that provided cheap labor for the Saudi economy as well. The Saudis proceeded to spread Wahhabi, Salafi ideology across Yemen. And with that ideology, they were able to recruit Yemeni mercenaries to join the ranks of al-Qaeda in the so-called jihad against the socialist Soviet-backed government of Afghanistan. After the unification of North and South Yemen in 1990, these Yemeni al-Qaeda mercenaries, they returned to Yemen. They were then unleashed against the Yemeni Socialist Party that had previously ruled South Yemen. Here it must be remembered that one of the few Yemeni politicians who had the courage to speak out against the violent jihadist al-Qaeda persecution of the South Yemeni socialists and Marxists was a man called Hussein al-Houthi, and he ended up becoming the founder of the Ansarullah movement until he was brutally murdered in 2004 by the Saleh regime on the orders of the United States. After the Yemeni Socialist Party had been completely crushed, the pro-Saudi regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh turned on the Houthis. So the irony of calling the Houthis rebels in this situation is that the Houthis actually never took up arms against the Yemeni state. It was the Yemeni state that took up arms against the Houthis in 2004. In fact, according to the RAND Corporation, the Houthis were acting within the boundaries of the laws and constitution. That's a direct quote. This is a think tank that advises the US military, so you can't accuse it of being biased in favor of the Houthis. They say that it was not until the US government pressured Saleh, that's the former president of Yemen, that he began cracking down on the Houthis. In other words, before the revolution, Yemen was ruled by the type of government that responded to a peaceful political movement with military force, because that's what the West wanted them to do. And because the war against Ansarullah was unpopular with the Yemeni people, they had to increasingly rely on using al-Qaeda militants to do the fighting. From 2004 to 2010, the old Yemeni government, the collaborationist, pro-American, pro-Saudi Yemeni government, waged 6 wars to crush the Ansarullah movement. But every time they tried, they not only failed, but the Ansarullah movement got stronger and stronger. Ansarullah belong to the Zaydi branch of Islam. They see themselves as the Sunnis of the Shia and the Shia of the Sunnis, like a bridge to bring harmony between the two sects of Islam. The Zaydis are the revolutionaries of Islam, and their core political belief is that Muslims have an obligation to rebel against corrupt and unjust rulers. So when you combine this with Arab nationalism, you get the Ansarullah movement. During the Arab Spring, to appease the Yemeni people, the US and Gulf monarchies stepped in to replace the old president with a new president. But the new president turned out to be far worse, and that's Abdurrab Mansour Hadi. Hadi tried to divide Yemen into 6 pieces so that they could separate the resource-rich regions with small populations from the resource-poor regions with large populations. And this was done to serve the interests of Saudi Arabia, as the brave journalism of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks revealed. And the reason they did this is because they wanted the untapped or the potential wealth of Yemen to be controlled more easily by them, by the Saudis. The Saudis wanted, and the Americans wanted, a weak and divided Yemeni state. Hadi also slashed the fuel subsidies, which caused inflation to rise by 200%. And because of this, by September 2014, Ansarullah had become so popular that the Yemeni state and army defected to the side of the Houthi revolution. So this is the only revolution to live up to the stated principles of the Arab Spring, but it's been completely ignored by the same forces, the same people, the same social movements, the same imperial cruise missile leftists who supported the fake revolutions in Libya and Syria. There's another reason the Western corporate media can't talk about this war, and that's because the US is on the same side as Al-Qaeda and Islamic State in Yemen. This is the dirty secret that they don't tell you. This is why there are voices in the US military even that are being completely ignored. And these voices, they favor the Ansarullah movement, surprisingly enough, because they've been told for the past 2 decades that the US is fighting al-Qaeda, when in fact the US has collaborated with al-Qaeda to destabilize the Arab world. Those who live in the West should be offended that our ruling classes constantly lie to us about their justifications for these extremely wasteful wars. That being said, the change of administration in the United States offers new opportunities for campaigning to end the war on Yemen. This is because in April 2019, the US Congress, they voted to end US support for the war, but it was vetoed by the outgoing president, Donald Trump, which is perhaps the single most evil act of his administration. Biden has promised to end US support for the Saudi-led war on Yemen. And so in this climate, it's extremely important to maintain the pressure on this administration to force them to live up to their promise. We should also be calling for the international recognition of the National Salvation Government of Yemen as the legitimate government of Yemen, because if that happens, then this war becomes automatically illegal and millions of lives can be saved. So to finish up, this is an immoral genocidal war, and the vast majority of humanity, the 99%, has an interest in supporting Yemeni national liberation. Thank you very much.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jay. That was a phenomenal whistle-stop tour of a very significant section of Arab and Yemeni history, and it's really very much appreciated. And in particular, what's appreciated, I think, is your reminder to us that the reason this war has dragged on for so long is that the Yemeni people are organized and resisting. And that resistance is absolutely, as you pointed out, steadfast and heroic, given the absolute imbalance of forces. The fact that despite the cholera, despite the starvation, these deliberate starvation tactics that have been employed by the Saudis and their imperialist backers, they are holding out. Otherwise, the war would not still be going on. The war would have been over a long time ago if there wasn't Yemeni resistance. It's the resistance that it means the war keeps carrying on, and the fact that the resistance are actually making gains is something that never enters our media. I often feel when there's a sudden spurt of interest in our media in peace talks in Yemen, it's actually spurred by a fear that the resistance might be winning. And that's one thing they don't want to see. They'd much rather have peace talks now before the resistance has won than let a victorious resistance set the terms. And that seems to me to be something that we should all watch out for, actually, when we see Yemen suddenly being covered in our media. Ask ourselves, why did they suddenly remember Yemen? But you're right also to draw attention to the fact that there is a renewed opportunity right now to hold Biden to his promises. It will be interesting to see how interested he is on delivering on those. I see Peter shaking his head. We're going to come now to our next speaker, George Samueli of the Global Policy Institute. We're very happy to have you with us, George. Our viewers will know you best, I think, from your many, many appearances on Crosstalk with RT. But you know, you've been a commentator on world affairs and imperialism for many years now. So, George, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. And thank you, Jyoti, and the Workers' Party for organizing this very important event. Unlike the previous speakers, I don't claim to be an expert on Yemen. I look upon it as the victim of an extraordinary aggression on the part of the strongest powers in the world. I mean, we've seen the horrors that have been perpetrated. We've seen the children being killed by bombs. We've seen hospitals destroyed. We've seen vital civilian infrastructure destroyed by Saudi bombs. We've seen the effects of the air, sea, and land blockade. And all of these horrors have been facilitated, active participation of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. And this was very active. It's not just that, oh, they're selling them arms. They are providing intelligence. They are providing intelligence for targets. They are providing air refueling facilities when they go on their bombing missions. They're providing training. So this is a very active involvement in war crimes. Now, this is war crimes by the very powers who never stop lecturing the rest of the world about human rights and about our values. We're apparently values. Well, that's all we really care about. You know, we have alliances based on values, and all very, very keen on putting others on trial. You know, holding international criminal trials for others for war crimes. But of course, the war crimes never apply to us. It's others who commit these war crimes. Now, the origins, I mean, Jyoti, you described very well the historical origins of the Yemeni conflict, Yemen's vital strategic location. And unfortunately, as with many parts of the world, when they happen to be located geographically in a very strategic location, or they happen to be next to coal mines, oil wells, something of value, they become the playthings of great powers. And that is indeed what has happened in the case of Yemen. I mean, it used to be a part of British India. Then the British just simply transferred it as part of Arabia as its interest changed. But the most recent horror story of Yemen goes back to the Obama administration. And when it decided in 2011 to seize on the Arab Spring as a mechanism for regime change and to expand US dominance over the Middle East. So in one glorious year in 2011, the United States demanded no less than 4 regimes in the Middle East to go away, to step down. They were no longer satisfactory to Washington. So there was Mubarak had to go, Gaddafi had to go, Assad had to go, and Saleh had to go, all in the space of a few months. This was the position of the Obama administration. In each of these cases, each of these 4 cases, there was absolute catastrophe for the countries involved. We've seen what's going on in Libya. We've seen the absolute horror show there. And of course, the Syrian war is continuing. And there's every indication that the people coming in with President Biden want to reignite that war. They want to continue with that regime change operation. And of course, we had Saleh in Yemen. Of course, that regime change operation ended in complete fiasco. The successor government was a disaster. It had no popular support. It was immediately rejected by the populace. And what then happened is, of course, the Saudi Arabia, when it along with its Gulf Cooperation Council allies, decided to just put its thumb on the scale and impose this government that has obviously been rejected by the people of Yemen. And here we have absolutely explicitly Barack Obama backed the Saudi intervention, the Saudi military intervention. There's a lot of talk that, oh, he didn't really support it, it was just done behind his back, and he was really against it and had nothing to do with him. No, there is absolute documentary evidence. He knew exactly what was involved, and he supported that intervention, as did his number 2, Joe Biden. And this is, and they've known all this time about the criminality of the Saudi campaign. So when we come across these stories now that there's, that Biden is supposedly going to abandon the support for the Saudi campaign in Yemen, why would anyone believe this? Other than the media want to present it as somehow, well, the Yemen war, that was really Trump's war. Let's not go back any further. It was just Trump. So Trump's the bad guy. So Trump's gone. Now these terrible things are going to go away. Well, of course, it's not going to go away, because the US-Saudi alliance is absolutely inextricable. I mean, it's like you can't separate these two powers. And it goes back to the days of FDR. It goes back to the Nixon doctrine with Saudi Arabia, and at that time, the Shah of Iran's Persia were to be this the ballast for the Nixon doctrine. They were the way to resist the Soviet aggression all over the world. And then we have, the Bush dynasty, with all their close familial relationships with Saudi Arabia. And so this has continued. So, and despite everything that we have known about everything in Saudi Arabia, I mean, leave aside the fact that it is the recipient of enormous amounts of US military hardware and UK military hardware, which is, of course, the key to the alliance, because a lot of money is at stake. They buy an enormous amount of weapons that they are unable to use. It's just this, but it's essentially a transfer of wealth to the United States and to the United Kingdom with a massive markup. But they don't know how to use it. I mean, we've seen that they are militarily completely incompetent. They're unable to win this war in Yemen. They can't even win a war against Qatar. So all this fancy, the most modern military hardware that they're buying, they have no idea how to use them, other than in a horrible, destructive fashion. So this is absolutely essential to a US economy. And therefore, there is no way in the world that the Biden administration will bring this at any time to an end. I mean, even when everything we have known about Al-Qaeda and how they've sponsored Al-Qaeda, all the madrasas that they have financed, and their direct involvement in the 9/11 attacks. I mean, all this has been documented, and still it makes no difference. But we have to then go through this charade with the media. We're saying, well, there's, the Saudis are really just doing all these terrible things, but now that Biden is there, he's going to, make sure that they behave themselves and that they're not going to do any of these things. I don't believe that is going to happen. I think this is, the crimes, will continue. And the U.S.-Saudi alliance will, go on and on. However, I think, as you, Jyoti, and others have pointed out, the Yemeni resistance is amazingly inspiring. I mean, I wouldn't have believed that they've been able to continue with this fight and even to prevail. So I'm pessimistic as to what happens in Washington, but I'm kind of optimistic about the Yemeni resistance. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, George. You do very right to point out to us the absolute hypocrisy of the imperialist ruling class, who go to these wars preaching to us about human rights, civilized values, freedom and democracy. In fact, we've come to a time where the words of our ruling classes have lost all connection with their meanings. And it's no wonder that there is what Peter on his show always talks about, this crisis of legitimacy. No wonder people are cynical. No wonder people don't trust politicians. No wonder people don't trust journalists. After a while, it becomes really clear that the words they say are the precise opposite of reality. You can't hide that forever. You really can't. And that, in fact, has been a huge factor in the rise of populism, in the rise of anger against the status quo. This sense that these people who are supposed to be our representatives, who we apparently elect, have nothing to do with us, are not representing us in any way, do not speak for us, are constantly trying to sell us a pill, constantly practicing their gestures to look sincere. Remember the Tony Blair effect? The guy had all these lessons on looking sincere, but you can't fake the eyes. Nobody looks sincere when they're doing the hand gestures and their face says something completely different. You can't, and people cotton onto it, after a while. The people who are bigging up Tony Blair now are the people who make money out of him. Nobody else. Not the mass of the workers saying bring back Tony Blair, is it? I'm going to move on now to our next contributor, Tim Anderson, who very kindly again has agreed to join us all the way from Sydney, Australia. It's an unearthly hour over there, and we're very grateful to have him with us. He's at the Centre for Counter-Hegemonic Studies He's very well known as someone who did tremendous work on publicizing what was really going on in Syria and countering the narrative there. And we're very happy to have him with us today talking about Yemen.
Thank you for that, Jyoti. Can you hear me? Thanks. And thanks to all the other participants. Thanks to the Workers' Party for organising this. I'm going to pick a little area which, taking advantage of the historical context that Jay gave for us and the political context that George has outlined, and just to talk about two things. One is the situation of the war on Yemen within the wider war on the region. That is to say, the New Middle East, what was called the New Middle East project outlined by the regime of George W. Bush. And then also the role of Israel in this war, because those things are not always readily apparent. I think generally with the New Middle East project, which was announced in Tel Aviv by Condoleezza Rice in 2006, just before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, it was made clear in the North American terms of bringing freedom and democracy to the region and so on. And we know that General Wesley Clark leaked that notion in the early part of this century that there was going to be the toppling of 7 governments in 5 years, that there was this wide-scale project in the region. And the dirty war on Yemen is part of that, part of all of those wars, those 7, or if you include Bahrain, 8 wars in the last 2 decades. I don't think we can understand any of them without looking at as a whole. And Jay has pointed out that the prize of Yemen is very much a strategic zone in the region. That is to say, the controlling of the straits into the Red Sea. We know that Israel and the UAE separately and together are based in Eritrea, looking across the straits at Hodeidah, the big port in Yemen there. And the blockade on Yemen is part of this project to get control of those straits and strategically control the commerce there. It has implications for all the other countries. Just recently, for example, a half dozen tankers sent from Iran to Syria. Some of them were harassed and held up in the Red Sea, but they got through eventually. So the strategic control of those straits is one of the important reasons why Yemen is this sought after prize. And of course, also the fact that the 2 major collaborators of the US in this region, Israel and Saudi Arabia, are very keen to get rid of any independent political will in the region at all, let alone on the borders of Saudi Arabia, where Yemen is a very bad example for democracy in the region for the Saudi regime. I won't go over what Jay said about the labeling of the Yemeni government as Houthis, trying to make a moral equivalence between them and the Saudis, that it's one family versus another family. There is indeed a coalition in Yemen, and it represents a very large majority of the population, despite the fact that it's being eaten away at different edges. But this new Middle East war is part of an attempt to get control of the entire region, at the expense of the potential competitors. This is the way Washington looks at it, that the influence of other big powers, China and Russia, but also Iran, which is the big independent power in the region, it's seen as a strategic competitor. And all of the other pretexts, the nuclear deal and so on, are trying to leverage that project, basically. Now, the role of Israel, which may not be obvious to people, and sometimes people wonder and have said a lot of strange things about why is it that the Ansar Allah movement has death to Israel in its coat of arms, when Israel does not appear to be directly involved. In fact, Israel is directly involved in a covert way in this war. When the Ansar Allah-led coalition came to power 6 years ago in Sana'a, they found Israeli weapons there, that the previous regime had indeed been involved with Israel, that Israel was covertly dealing with the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular at that time with that project. And fairly recently, about a year and a half ago, there was the government in Sana'a announced that they feared an Israeli attack for the same reasons that the Israelis keep attacking Syria. Whenever the proxy armies, in the case of Yemen, the mercenary groups and the Al-Qaeda groups, particularly in South Yemen, were facing defeat, the Israelis would intervene with missile strikes to try and give them, breathe new life into the destabilization. And of course, Israel is, as an agent of the big power of the US, is very much involved in this attempt to try and smash up any Arab regime, to fragment it, to break it into a million pieces. I think Jay pointed out that the Hadi regime was talking about 6 different pieces. But of course, it's the same thing they've been doing in Iraq, trying to balkanize Iraq, trying to balkanize Syria, trying to reduce it down to ethnic tribes and protectorates that are run by either Mr. Erdogan or Israel in the south and so on. So there's that same strategy. They don't want a strong, independent political will in Yemen. Now, Israel, through its normalization process, which the Trump administration initiated, first of all, with the Emirates and Bahrain, has become more of an open collaborator with the Emirates, for example, and that poses problems for Yemen because Israel may become directly involved. The government in Sana'a said they will retaliate directly if Israel becomes involved. We know they have the capacity because they've been carrying out strikes on Saudi refineries, for example, which are a long way from Yemen. The specter of more direct Israel involvement in Yemen is a very real one and has been enhanced by this so-called normalization project. Just finally on that, I might just add that the final devastating, malicious act of trying to designate the Ansarullah movement as a terrorist group has aggravated the economic war that's at the root of this broader regional war, basically. That is to say, you have comprehensive sanctions against Syria, against large parts of Lebanon and Iraq, against Iran, a blockade on Yemen, a blockade on Palestine. You have this economic war going on, and the designation of the effective government of Yemen as a terrorist group is something that simply chills the possibility of any humanitarian aid or commerce there. It means that any of those NGOs or trading groups are now facing the real possibility their members might be arrested and jailed by the US regime, which we know is acting against journalists like Julian Assange and others. It's a real chilling effect on the possibility of bringing any relief to the Yemeni people, and it forms a package, in my view, with the sanctions, which we know now, thankfully, because we have UN rapporteurs who are talking about the criminality of the sanction regimes, or really they should be called unilateral coercive measures. That is to say, they're economic siege measures, and it's been condemned as against Cuba, as against Venezuela, as against Syria. A similar thing with Yemen there, that we should be drawing attention to the contribution to the genocide against the Yemeni people of this recent designation in the dying days of the Trump regime. It was said amongst analysts in Washington to be something to do with trying to give a reward to the Saudis in the middle of a failing war there, basically, a sop to the Saudis and trying to encourage them into this normalization process. It's very unclear whether the Biden administration is going to do anything to change this, but I think we shouldn't let people forget that this designation of Ansarullah as a terrorist group is another blow against the Yemeni people, another terrible part of this genocidal war against the Yemeni people. So thanks once again, Jyoti and your comrades, for organising this seminar. That's all I have to say at this stage.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tim. We're really, really grateful for your contribution and for many important reminders there about what's really happening and what the real forces are and why they have the motivations that they do. I'm going to move straight on now to our next speaker, Chris Williamson. Our audience in Britain will not need any introduction for Chris, but for the benefit of those coming from further afield, Chris was formerly a Member of Parliament in Britain for the Labour Party. He was one of the closest allies of Jeremy Corbyn during the period of his leadership, and in fact was booted out of the Labour Party for being rather too loyal to Jeremy Corbyn and to the cause of peace and justice. And in particular for his refusal to give up on support for the Palestinian people, which of course had him branded as an anti-Semite, and that was the basis on which they kicked him out, just as it was the basis on which the media hounded Jeremy Corbyn for 4 years. Chris Williamson, since that time, has founded a movement in this country called the Resistance Movement, and he comes now to us from Derby in the north of England, northish.
Well, Northeast, yeah, thanks very much indeed, Jyoti, for that introduction. It's the Midlands, really, the East Midlands where we are, but the kind of gateway to the North is how we like to describe ourselves, really. I just want to pay tribute to the incredible contributions that we've heard this evening from the previous speakers. And I myself am no expert, but I'm very concerned, obviously, about what's been happening in Yemen. And we know that it is the world's worst humanitarian crisis that's taking place right now. And just looking at some of the statistics before I joined the meeting this evening, it's an incredible fact that 80% of the Yemeni population, as a result of this war, are now forced to survive on foreign aid. And that is just completely unacceptable and something that we should all be rightly ashamed of, given Britain's involvement in this terrible war. The scale of suffering is unimaginable, and we've heard a flavour of some of that this evening, and those of us that have looked into it in a little bit more depth. I mean, it's truly horrendous, and it's absolutely right to describe it as the world's worst humanitarian, well, it's a catastrophe rather than a crisis, and it's a war that's been going on now for almost as long as World War II. And there doesn't appear to be any obvious end in sight, but obviously we need to work hard to try and bring that about. And when you look at, I mean, you know, obviously I don't like you kind of use statistics all the time, but I was looking at the Yemen data project, or some of the stats that they've put out now. Since the start of the war, there's been 22,485 air raids, and at least 30% of those air raids have been against non-military targets. 2,175 residential areas, according to the Yemen data project, have been targeted. 244 schools have been targeted with these air raids. 33 hospitals, 65 food storage facilities. And I think it was George that mentioned the war crimes. These are absolutely war crimes. There is no doubt about it. I mean, and the people responsible should be in the International Criminal Court. And as Ruben has said, you know, Britain is implicated in this. And that should shame us all, as I've said, Jyoti. It really should, because the bombs and the planes are built in the United Kingdom. And it's very, very profitable. Very, very profitable. I mean, you know, ranging from the bomb or missiles, ranging from about 22,000 right up to the cruise missiles at around £750,000 per pop, as it were. And so, understandably, the people involved in those industries, you know, are cashing in. And they are very influential, regrettably, on the political scene. And I think it was you, Jyoti, that called into question the suitability of our democracy. You're absolutely right. It's a passion of mine. I think representative democracy totally failing us, because the representatives that we have in the Houses of Parliament are not representing the people that elect them, in my opinion. They are representing the lobbyists. They're representing the military-industrial complex. How can it be that we are saying that jobs are reliant upon the kind of arms industry? I mean, Britain is, I think, the second biggest arms exporter in the world. And I think Saudi Arabia is the biggest client of those arms exports. It is an absolute disgrace. And it's something that it's really important, I think, that we bring this to the attention of the people, because there are alternatives to building weapons of war. And we know that from the work that was done by the Lucas Shop Stewards Combine as long ago as 1976, when they said we can put our high-tech skills, instead of building weapons of war, armaments and so on, we can use them for socially useful products. And I think they came up with around 150, but sadly none of them were ever put into production in this country. But I think the vast majority of them were put into production elsewhere. I mean, they were coming forward back in 1976, for example, with things like solar power, combined heat and power, and these sorts of things. You know, wind turbines was another area that they were suggesting that could be used. Hybrid vehicles and so on. They were well ahead of their time, and these were workers on the shop floor who were coming forward with it. So there is an alternative. And the arguments about, you know, jobs being reliant upon the arms industry, even though it's an immoral argument, it doesn't really play, because there are alternatives. And in any event, the defense industry in this country is in terminal decline in terms of the number of jobs, because since 1981, where there was around 430,000 people employed in arms manufacture, it's now around 130,000. So 2/3 of the jobs have gone anyway. So it's so important, I think, therefore, that we're arguing for defense diversification. But going back to Yemen, I mean, the fact is And again, just to kind of repeat the point that Ruben made about Britain being implicated in this. I mean, there are around 6,000, over 6,000, in fact, British contractors stationed in Saudi who are providing training for pilots and carrying out the maintenance on the aircraft. There are RAF personnel in the Saudi Command and Control Center, where the targeting, where the selection of targets in Yemen actually takes place. So I think that, you know, it is possible to end this war. And I know, I think George said that, you know, the war will go on and, you know, Biden coming is not going to make a great deal of difference. And I don't particularly disagree with that. I mean, I'm reminded really of the Gramsci quote about pessimism of intellect and optimism of the will. Well, you know, I'm optimistic of the will. Let's be optimistic in terms of what we can force our political representatives to do, because we know, and if we can get this information out there to the public, I think they would be horrified about the fact that this war is only being able to be prosecuted thanks to the efforts of British military personnel and British contractors. And we should therefore be putting pressure on our so-called representatives to actually, you know, bring this war to an end. And I think if we can, through our will, through our collective power that we have, I think we can bring sufficient pressure to actually bring about the change. And you know, I think it was Ruben mentioned Lance Corporal Ahmed al-Batati, who bravely drew attention to the war in Yemen. I mean, this was a serving soldier who produced a video about the war in Yemen, said he wasn't prepared to continue to serve in the British Army whilst this arms trade was going on. And he then conducted a vigil outside the Ministry of Defence, said he would blow a whistle every 10 minutes to represent a child which is killed on average every 10 minutes in Yemen. And, you know, he was arrested, obviously, and I was involved in mounting or supporting a campaign on behalf of Ahmed. And thankfully, you know, he wasn't prosecuted. There was a fear that he would be subject to a court-martial, but he's been thrown out of the army. But thankfully, I think, thanks to the pressure that we put on, and this is where I think, you know, the pressure can work, you know, the optimism of will. We were able to, I think, you know, prevent Ahmed from being subject to a court-martial. And we really do need to celebrate people like that, because it was an incredibly brave thing to do, because the pressure, the peer pressure, you know, the pressure from the, you know, the commanding officers and so on is so intense in the army, as we know. And to see you know, a gesture like that, it is incredible. And it's something that I think we should absolutely celebrate. But I want to just also, before I finish, Joe, to just touch on and pick up on a point that Tim mentioned about the role of the Emirates, the United Arab Emirates. And it's important to think that we don't lose sight of the fact that there is a coalition prosecuting this war. It's not just Saudi. And, you know, the United Arab Emirates are heavily involved. I think they've withdrawn their own military service personnel, but they are still absolutely involved in the conflict there through sponsoring brutal militias, absolutely brutal militias, and mercenary death squads. And I was looking up something again just before we came on air, Joe Tia. The Rights Radar Foundation and the International Institute for Rights and Development told the Human Rights Council in Geneva that the UAE have hired American mercenaries to carry out high-profile assassinations in Yemen. And this is something else that we absolutely, I think, need to give the oxygen of publicity to, because I think people will be absolutely horrified on both sides of the Atlantic that this sort of thing is going on. So behind the glossy propaganda relating to the United Arab Emirates, you know, the Emirates Airlines, their involvement in British horse racing, the Premier League and all that kind of thing, the UAE is heavily involved in this conflict. They are an anti-democratic, brutal regime, which is not just in terms of influencing the situation in Yemen, but has a pernicious influence on the whole region. And they really fear, I think, you know, Arab democracy, and doing their level best to put an end to it. And this is why it was such a chilling move when we saw the links, which again Tim touched on, that they're now normalizing so-called relations with Israel. That is a very worrying development, and something that, you know, we need to do everything we can to rail against and highlight, you know, the reasoning behind it and what the implications of that actually are. And so I think meetings like this are so important, really, in bringing the oxygen of publicity to the reality of the situation in Yemen and all the other aspects of it, which, as I say, Tim touched on. That was just one aspect of it in relation to those links between Israel and the UAE and what that might mean. And so I think, just in conclusion then, Jyoti, what I would say is that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, are behaving like rogue states, and we should therefore treat them as such. And that's the way to go, I think, and demand that our representatives, stop the kind of normalized relations with these rogue states, and start bringing pressure on them to change their appalling and despicable ways, which is wreaking such appalling suffering on the Yemeni people.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that powerful contribution. And you remind us, of course, of the criminal destruction of all the infrastructure that's necessary for life, that's going on underneath Saudi's American and US bombs, the destruction of food and water supplies, of roads, of railways, of schools, of hospitals. Everything that you need to live is being destroyed in an attempt to starve the people there into submission. And that makes their resistance, I think, all the more impressive and powerful, and something that should be much more celebrated and known about than it is. Chris rightly points out that this is a criminal, unjust, aggressive war. And we must also always remember, when we're talking about, our rulers love to tell us that they got the United Nations to agree to their latest invasion. Unjust, aggressive war, the invasion of another country, was classified by the Nuremberg tribunals after World War II as the highest of crimes, as a crime against humanity, the crime of all crimes, to wage an unjust war. And the role of the media was also held up in Nuremberg as a crime against humanity, to facilitate such a war with propaganda which either prettifies it, normalizes it, excuses it, or suppresses information about it. All of that is absolutely criminal in terms of international law, as if our rulers have any interest actually in the realities of international law, but they like to pretend that they do. And that's something that we should therefore understand, that as far as there is such a thing as international law, these wars and the support of them by the media are absolutely against those laws and against all principles of humanity. I'd like to come now to Caleb Morpin. He's in New York. He will be familiar to many of our viewers here as a journalist and spokesperson at, or commentator, I should say, at RT America. Caleb, we're very grateful to you for joining us. Over to you.
Sure. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining this very important web conference, and I want to thank everyone who had me join this panel, because it's been very educational. And so little is known about the war in Yemen in the United States. There is just so little known about it. And I'm going to frame my brief remarks in talking about how we can go about taking on the responsibility of explaining this war to our friends, to our neighbors, to our coworkers, because there is so much misinformation and confusion about it in the country. I mean, in the United States, I'm sure in the UK as well, average people on the street just have no idea what is going on in Yemen. And when they think they know what's going on in Yemen, they're even more misinformed than if they didn't know. And in the United States right now, there are big political divisions. Folks saw what happened on January 6th and the attack on the US Capitol. And because of that, there are big divisions. And we really have overall roughly two narratives going out about the war in Yemen. And both of these narratives, one from the more liberal wing of the American ruling class, one from the more conservative, or I guess I should say neoconservative wing of the American ruling class. And both of these narratives are completely and utterly false. The first narrative that we hear from American mainstream media, from outlets like MSNBC and CNN that lean closer to the Democratic Party, the narrative that we hear is that this war in Yemen is just complicated. It is an ethnic and tribal conflict These are groups of people that have been fighting with each other for thousands of years. It's something we in the West just can't possibly understand. So you should change the channel and look the other way and just assume that this is something that only people with PhDs in Middle Eastern history and such can actually understand. That's the way liberals would like us to understand it. Well, that narrative is completely and utterly false. If people in the United States can understand an event called the American Revolution, then they can understand what is happening in Yemen. The people of Yemen, a country that is very poor, is fighting for its national liberation. It doesn't want a foreign king and a foreign regime to dominate their country and keep it economically destitute. They are fighting for their national liberation. It's quite interesting that often one fact that is obscured by American media, when they'll talk about the Houthis and Ansar Allah, one thing that they won't talk about is their logo. You very rarely will see the logo of the Ansar Allah movement. And if you look at the logo of the Ansar Allah movement, it has a hand representing the hand of God. It has a gun representing the right to armed self-defense, something that many Americans very strongly feel is important. But there is also one item on the logo that is very important in understanding this war, and that is a shaft of wheat. If you look at the logo of Ansar Allah, it has a shaft of wheat. And the reason that their logo has a shaft of wheat on it is because that shaft of wheat represents economic development. Saudi domination of Yemen is about keeping Yemen an underdeveloped country. It is about keeping Yemen in an economic state of poverty as simply a client state of the Saudis. And what the revolutionary movement in Yemen is fighting for is breaking those chains and allowing Yemen to build up its own economy and develop. There was a BBC interview where they interviewed a leader of the Ansar Allah movement, and he said that not only do they study the Islamic Revolution of Iran, that they also study what is happening in Venezuela with Bolivarian socialism, and that they are inspired by many different revolutionary movements around the world, because ultimately what this war is about Yemeni people and the Yemeni nation struggling to rise out of poverty and to develop its own economy. And that's the basis of this. So that liberal narrative that it's too complicated to understand is completely and utterly wrong. It is a nation fighting for its independence. You could say that Yemen is almost the Vietnam of our time. Now, the second narrative that we get, and this is from more neoconservative leaning outlets. You get this from Fox News in particular. You get this from the Wall Street Journal and outlets associated with Rupert Murdoch and more explicitly neoconservative elements, is they don't say it's too complicated to understand. They say that this is a proxy war with Iran. That is their narrative. They say, well, this isn't really about Yemen. This is Iran trying to take over Yemen. This is an Iranian conspiracy to start a war. So we have to fight Iran in Yemen. And that narrative is also completely and utterly false. But it's quite interesting if you draw a historical parallel, because it forces me to think about a time in US history. You know, you go back to the 1950s, 1954, you had an event called the Montgomery bus boycott, where the African-American community was mobilizing in the thousands against Jim Crow segregation and protesting. And what did American media say about the massive protests that were happening in the US South? They said that this was a conspiracy from the Soviet Union. It was a communist plot. The civil rights movement was a communist conspiracy. It's not that the Black people of the United States want freedom and the right to, you know, eat in whatever restaurant they want and be able to vote and drink out of the same drinking fountains as white people. Oh no, this is all a conspiracy from Moscow. Now, there was a grain of truth, right? Let's not forget that the Communist Party had organized for civil rights long before any other progressive forces in the United States had. Let's not forget that at the UN, the Soviet Union brought the petition called We Charge Genocide and called out the racism of the United States at the United Nations and gave a platform to people like William L. Patterson and Henry Winston and Paul Robeson and many great African-American activists to expose racism. So there was a grain of truth in that narrative. But overall, the reason that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and millions of people in the United States were protesting for civil rights was not because of the Soviet Union. It was because of their real conditions becoming intolerable and the demand for justice being widespread. And if this war in Yemen were simply an Iranian conspiracy, it would have been over in a week, right? The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has the 4th largest military budget of any country in the world. Meanwhile, Yemen is one of the deeply poorest countries on the planet. It's really a country where people are facing just impoverished conditions. And the fact that the people of Yemen have continued to fight against the largest military budget, the 4th largest military budget in the world, and completely continued to withstand this criminal blockade that has prevented them from getting medicine and supplies. The fact that they have held out so long and continued to resist as just, mass deaths of malnutrition, bombing of civilian infrastructure. The fact that in face of all of this, they have continued to resist is about as much of a solid proof that this is not a conspiracy from Iran that could ever be. If there was not widespread support for the national liberation movement of the people of Yemen, then this war would certainly not have continued so long. I'm forced to think of a very important quotation from Mao Zedong, the founder of the Chinese Revolution. In one of his last statements that was delivered, he said that the people of a small country can surely defeat aggression by a big country. This is a law of history, but only if they dare to rise in struggle. And those words just ring in my ears every time I think about the conflict in Yemen, because this is the people of a small country facing aggression by a big country, but rising in struggle and resisting. And this law of history that Mao Zedong talked about seems to be very well alive. I will just conclude by saying that in 2015, after this war had just started, I had the honor and the privilege of accompanying the Red Crescent Society of the Islamic Republic of Iran on a ship to try and deliver humanitarian aid to the people of Yemen. And for me, as someone from the United States, this was a life-changing experience. I spent 13 days on that ship. We had all kinds of wheat and all kinds of medical supplies. We had surgeons on board. We had technicians of an operating theater. And it was a purely humanitarian mission by the Red Crescent Society. And we were unable to reach the port of Hodeidah in 2015 because the port of Hodeidah was bombed 8 times on the day we were chartered to arrive. I was bombed 8 times, and to prevent this humanitarian mission from arriving, they murdered basically a number of dock workers, a number of medical students. They bombed the medical university in Hodeidah, and we were forced to turn our ship around. And we had to go then to Djibouti, and we handed over our medical supplies and our food relief to the United Nations Relief Works Agency. And we assume that aid was delivered, but we really don't know. There's a lot of distrust for the United Nations Relief Works Agency and such. But it was a crime against humanity. You cannot block humanitarian aid from being delivered. And they tried to spread lies. In the media, they claimed that there were weapons on board our ship, and this was somehow an effort to deliver weapons. Well, when the United Nations Relief Works Agency inspected our ship, they saw that there were no weapons on the ship. We were not engaging in any kind of military operation. We were simply trying to deliver humanitarian aid, but the Saudis prevented it and murdered people to prevent that aid from being delivered. And what happened, while it was certainly well known throughout the Middle East, it was not widely known. It was reported on a little bit in American media, but it got very little coverage. The fact that a humanitarian mission with citizens, not just me from the United States, there was a German citizen on board, there was a French citizen on board, there were a number of Iranians on board, that we were prevented from delivering humanitarian aid. And that shows how ruthless the Saudis really are, that they have been given a free pass when it comes to violating international law, committing war crimes, committing atrocities, not just internationally, but against their own people as well. Let's not forget the horrendous way that these Shia oil workers of Saudi Arabia are treated, the way they are viciously exploited, the way Sheikh Namir al-Namir, a leader who had fought for the civil rights of the Shia oil workers of Saudi Arabia, was brutally executed. So we need to continue to raise awareness about what's going on. We need to continue to talk to our friends, to our co-workers, to our classmates if we're students at universities, and get the truth out there about what is taking place in Yemen. I think that the last minute move by the Trump administration to label the Ansar Allah group as terrorists was strategically done. It follows the vein of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, of the ripping up of the Iran nuclear deal, that there are different factions within our ruling class in the United States that have differences about how to handle the conflict in the Middle East, and that Trump aligned himself with Netanyahu and the Likud party in Israel, and that they had a particular interest in preventing any negotiations. The aim was to make it more difficult for Biden to negotiate both with the Islamic Republic of Iran and now with the revolutionary forces in Yemen by labeling them as terrorists, by murdering the top Iranian general. The effort is to try and prevent negotiations so the money for weapons manufacturers such as Betsy DeVos, right? Betsy DeVos, Trump's Secretary of Education, is the brother of Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, the huge military contracting corporation. And, you know, to keep the weapons flowing in, to keep building the Arab NATO the Trump administration wants to build, to keep selling all kinds of armaments to US-aligned despotic regimes throughout the Middle East. There's a desire to prevent any negotiation or softening of relations. But we can hope that perhaps one positive that can come out of the new administration is perhaps they will have a different approach. Perhaps some kind of negotiation can take place. And perhaps the United States will recognize that the people of Yemen are not going to surrender. They are going to keep fighting for their national liberation. So it would be better to negotiate with them. It would be better to call off their Saudi attack dogs. And it would be better to somehow recognize the Yemeni people and their right to have their own government and their own national sovereignty. So I think there is hope that perhaps some negotiation can take place. There are differences among our ruling classes, both in the United States and in Britain. But we should all be doing all we can to raise awareness about the real crimes against humanity that are happening in Yemen, but also to raise awareness about the relentless spirit of the Yemeni people and their fight for national liberation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Caleb. And you raised there a really important point, I think, that it's the combination of divisions amongst our rulers with the inroads being made by the resistance, which I think is forcing the ruling class into a potential to consider a change of approach. They may well find they have to call off the Saudi attack dogs because there's no other way. It may be that saying that it's because Joe Biden came in is a face-saving means of going about that. Oh, it was Trump's war, forget about Obama, as I think George was saying earlier. And now Biden can come like riding his horse to the rescue. And we can conveniently forget to mention that, in fact, any negotiation that does take place will have been forced to come about because of the Yemeni people's resistance. That is a narrative that we will not see in our media. So they may well be positioning themselves to accept a defeat, but dress it up as, you know, a victory. And you said something there I just wanted to pick up on very quickly before I introduce Peter, about Donald Trump being dumb, strategically dumb. And of course, he has been a nightmare for the ruling class in many, many ways, because he's constantly blatantly siding with forces that he's supposed to pretend not to support and letting out truths that he's not supposed to let out. So, you know, what is the crime actually that's been committed by the Yemenis? Well, it's that they're striving for independence whilst living in a place that the imperialists want to control. Now, nobody ever says these things, but Donald Trump did. He said it about Syria. Do you remember? It's not our fault that they put their villages over our oil wells, right? He lets the cat out of the bag. And that's exactly how we have to understand what's going on in Yemen. It's not America's fault that the Yemenis are living in a place that we need to control. It's next to our oil. It's next to our sea shipping lanes. It's on top of our resources. It's inconvenient that they're sitting there in a place that we need to control. And what happens to the people, they have no interest in whatsoever, literally none. The criminality, the barbarity of this system is constantly staggering to anybody who looks at the world through a human perspective. How can you stand by and commit such atrocities against, essentially defenseless people? It's staggering. And that is, I think, I can't remember who said earlier, one of the reasons it's not covered is because you can't justify it. If anybody really understood the details, they'd be shocked. That's why we don't talk about it. Now I'm going to come to Peter Lavelle. Again, for most of our audience, he'll need no introduction. You've got quite a fan base, Peter, on both sides of the Atlantic, as the host of RT's flagship show, Crosstalk. And we're very, very grateful that you joined us tonight. Peter, take it away.
First of all, I want to thank you for hosting this. I think for me, it's been very educational. Jay, if you're still with us, I can't see you. Probably the best master class I've ever been given in such a short time frame. Absolutely wonderful presentation, and everyone has added here. Also, I want to make it very clear, this is bipartisan, okay? And that's that is the primary reason why I'm here, okay? Because I want to show, and Jyoti, you know that, because we met in I think it was in February before all the lockdown nonsense for Julian Assange. That's a conservative position as well, okay? And it's not aired as much. And I'm constantly telling people that I can reach across the aisle, and I'm so grateful that people do cross back to me, okay? So I compliment you all. Caleb brought up something, kind of stole a little bit of my wind. I'm not very happy about that. But he's right. This is always presented as being complicated. And it was a few months ago, we were all on Crosstalk discussing a possible Biden foreign policy. And we had kind of a typical talking head from the Democratic Party. Television can be a bit monotonous because you kind of have to create these scarecrow arguments, and I don't like it that way because it's always more complex. And so I was asking the Democrat, and she came out with the usual thing. Well, it's complicated, and I just interrupted and said, no, it's wrong. It's simple. It's just wrong. Okay. It's just simply wrong. And one of the times, and I got a lot of commentary, and not always very nice, we did a program specifically on Yemen. I think I'm the only, outside of Al Jazeera because of its regional interest, but I don't think any other program in the English language had more programs on Yemen than Crosstalk, okay? And we had a Saudi spokesperson, Ahmed, I remember him very well. And I just wouldn't let him go. I just kept going out. I actually kind of pushed the other guests aside. And I said, why are you pursuing this war? And what does victory mean? And of course, as you've all mentioned, like it's Iran, and all this, and Saudi Arabia is in the G20. And it's like, okay, but how does that justify your war? Okay. And of course he stumbled all over himself. He made a fool out of himself essentially. And I was just unrelenting. And I heard later that one of his producers, because he was part of some kind of media organization in Riyadh, communicated with my people, and basically, I'm going to make a formal complaint to the Russian Foreign Ministry. And I sent it back through the chain. I said, go ahead and tell them that I could argue your case better than you can. Okay, and this is what shows the laziness of mind and the lack of any kind of moral clarity. Is that, they get away with their narratives. It's complicated. No, it's not. It's simply wrong. And one of the things that's for, we always say awareness, but particularly in this case here, because we have so much media control right now. And I'm really lucky in our discussion. I get to mention one word that hasn't been mentioned yet. And I'm a little bit surprised. Raytheon. What you're talking about ruling classes? What about the people? The ruling classes are in their pocket. Okay, who do we have coming on board? Oh, Lloyd Austin. Well, he hasn't even been confirmed yet. He's still on Raytheon's board. Okay, let's look at Raytheon. In 2015, its share price was $108. Now it is $180 as of 2019. No, it's not the ruling elites that are going to be deciding things here. Most of them are too mediocre and incompetent. Okay, and they do this, and it's already been mentioned here. You know, blame Bush, blame Obama, blame Trump. Yeah, well, this is what they do because they don't really know what they're doing, except for their friends are making a whole lot of money. Oh, and when they're out of government, they're going to go over to Raytheon too. Okay, this is how it works. It's very, very simple. Okay, and the whole concept of international law, which all of us hold very dear here. And George, you know, George and I, we need to plug it. We have our own YouTube channel, The Gaggle, which George and I do every single day, except for today, for some reason. You know, we always are stressing international law because international law, well, that should apply to everyone. No, it applies to everybody else except for us. Look at British media. Look at American media. How often is international law mentioned? It doesn't really exist. It doesn't exist. And even if I were to argue these things on American television, on Fox or on CNN, they wouldn't have a clue what I was talking about. They really wouldn't. And going back to, I like this term, this glossy propaganda, you know, and this is exactly what it is, because as has already been said here, there's no justification for this conflict whatsoever. It is not justified. Now, Caleb is absolutely right. I mean, it's because of America's obsession with Iran, obsession with it. George and I were brought up with it, okay? And so this is how Yemen is always mentioned. And it mentions, you know, going back to Jay's presentation and Jota yourself giving the introduction here, leaves out so many other things. And so what I will do, and I will continue to do, and this is such a wonderful a bullpen for guests for my program, Crosstalk. I'm very happy about that. What we need to do is pursue it. Now, people have said, Biden, you know, no, forget Biden, okay? Think of Blinken, okay? He's got blood on his hands all the way up to his shoulders on this, okay? And when he says the Biden administration will not support, what in your news speak, what does support mean? Okay, I don't take you at your word because you're all liars, okay? All of them are. Now, we'll have to take it step by step. But, you know, Anthony Blinken is going to have to talk to Raytheon, okay? And Raytheon's going to talk to Joe. And I don't think Joe's going to resist very much here. So what I worry about, I'm very pessimistic here. I'm very pessimistic, particularly as it has been very rightly pointed out, when there's a balance of force that is out of whack, Israel will intervene. Now, there is one thing that hasn't been mentioned here, and I take it very, very seriously, and I'm not prone to hyperbole. The end of Saudi Arabia, that is in the cards right now. It is in the cards. And all I can say to the people of Yemen, hang on, because when, you know, everyone, I remember so clearly the Cold War, will we ever have a conflict in the United States versus the Soviet Union, the Western Bloc, the Soviet Bloc and all that? No, one gave up. And Saudi Arabia is aiming or moving in the direction of a failed state. And with the attack on the Aramco facilities, it tells us everything we need to know. They are extremely vulnerable, and that is why we had the deal of the century with the Arab states recognizing Israel. What a crock! What a crock! The way it's been sold to us in the media. That was, you know, Trump wanted to get out of these wars. He failed. I'll give him this. He tried. Okay, but I don't like losers. Okay, he failed. All right. So his deal of the century, you know what it did? It just entrenched the United States even deeper, even longer in the Middle East through arms deals. Everybody talks about, you know, the diplomatic end of it. That is a facade. Look at the fine print. Look at the fine print. Okay, this has everything to do with creating an alliance against Iran, and this is a justification for their continued assault on Yemen because they believe this nonsense. Look, there was hardly any, if zero, Iranian influence in Yemen before all of this. Okay, and with, as Caleb rightly pointed out, with the blockade in force like it is, I seriously doubt there's much aid. Maybe comfort, yes, but aid, I very much doubt here. So I think we have to look at some really big, major changes going on in the Middle East. And who knows, it may be Yemen is the one that will break the proverbial camel's back. Okay, because I think it's in the cards here. Saudi Arabia is in a mess financially. It's in a mess. It spends like a drunken sailor, and it continues to pay off all of the people that will talk good about it. I've always said on Crosstalk, my guests, particularly from the West, they say very, very little about Israel. They never say a word about Saudi Arabia. That's how powerful their money is in the halls of power here. So to make a sum up, I learned so much from this panel. I really did, and I'm really glad I participated in it. Is that we have to hold together and show this to people. And if people watch this, you can't deny you didn't know. And I think we need to shame people, shame our friends if we have to, shame our family members if we have to. Watch this. You cannot deny what's going on. And once you understand that, you have to say something. You have to say something and even act, okay? This is a righteous cause, and we have to continue opening people's eyes to it. Because if we don't, we're complicit. Jyoti, you did a wonderful job. Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic contribution, Peter. Thank you so much for that. Absolutely brilliant. And you're right to remind us that this is a bipartisan platform and a bipartisan cause. You don't have to be a socialist or a left-winger to be against imperialism. Of course, it's my view that to be the most thorough type of anti-imperialist, you really do need to be a socialist. Peter, I have hopes that one of these days you'll cross the aisle and be one of us. I feel like in spirit you're with us. But anti-imperialism is anti-imperialism, and it needs to unite the broadest number of people that it possibly can. We are never going to be sectarian about whose platforms we're on or who is on our platform. If they are prepared to speak to the cause, or if they are prepared to let us speak to their audience, we will always accept. We do not buy into this culture of no platforming. If a fascist invited me to speak to his audience, I would do so. Because that, as far as I'm concerned, that's an opportunity to put an argument before a whole load of people who aren't hearing that argument. And how else are we going to change people's minds if they never hear our arguments? None of that makes any sense to me. We're very grateful to have you here tonight. You've made a wonderful and very spirited contribution in your inimitable style, as you do. And you've pointed out, of course, the laziness of the defenders of these unjustifiable wars, the laziness of the defenders of Zionism, the laziness of the defenders of Saudi brutality. And of course, they are allowed to be lazy, as you rightly pointed out, because they don't have to justify themselves. Who calls them to account? They are protected by the armies, by the governments, by the diplomats, and by the media of the United States and Britain, two of the most powerful countries in the world. Like Israel, the Saudis feel they have absolute immunity for whatever they do on the international stage. And for now, they have done. But I think, Peter, you're absolutely right to say that in both countries, that rests on very shaky foundations. In Israel, they have the very shaky foundation of a Palestinian population that has refused to go away, despite 7 decades of attempted genocide. They're still there. They're still resisting. They haven't gone. And that forms a sand, if you like, for the foundations of Israel, and it will collapse one of these days. And the same with Saudi Arabia. They have a huge native population which is restive. They are, as you say, bankrupting themselves in an attempt to try to keep control. At some point, it's all going to fall down, and there's going to come a point where they are no longer useful to the imperialists. And when that day comes, you will find that the House of Saud is not nearly as strong as it looks for all of its weapons. I just want to finish tonight's meeting by saying that, this is a cause that British workers absolutely should care about. They should care because it's right, as Peter said. They should also care because Britain is involved up to its neck in the blood of the Yemeni people. We are providing, as has been pointed out here, armed support, armed forces. Our armed forces are there, not just advising, but taking part in gathering intelligence and locating targets, drawing up lists of people for them to bomb and kill. Our media is apologizing for or suppressing information about, which is equally culpable, this criminal war. And many of our companies are in one way or another facilitating or making money out of it. And British workers, therefore, are also involved. Anyone who works for any of those companies, anyone who works for the media machine, anyone who is in any way connected to any of that, including the soldiers, has an involvement in a criminal, aggressive war. And we need to build a movement that helps those people not only to recognize their complicity, but realize that they have a necessity and an ability to fight back and to refuse to cooperate. But, you know, refusing to cooperate, as much as it's wonderful to see the example of individuals who do that, it is only truly effective when it's a mass movement, when we do it together. As an organized working class, we actually could stop British involvement, not just highlight it, not just create a little PR stir, but actually stop it in its tracks. And that is the goal of the Workers' Party, to rebuild the kind of working class movement in Britain, which is capable of, has the intention of using that power and is capable of using it in order to stop British imperialism in its tracks. That is our ambition. And that's why we hope that you will join us, those of you who are living in Britain and watching this tonight, join us and help us get the working class off its knees, get ourselves organized and fight back. I'm really sorry to have to inform everybody who was waiting for him so patiently that George is stuck on the road. He was delivering a fantastic Moats show in London last night. As we know, he now lives in Scotland. Somewhere along the way, presumably it's the snow, he's not been able to make it to his northern studio. So we're very sorry to miss him. His contributions are always fantastic. But I hope you'll agree that tonight's panel has made up for his absence. It's been a very varied, very interesting, very educational, very inspiring meeting. George will be here again tomorrow at 8 p.m. On Wednesday at 8 p.m. as usual, giving our Workers' Party political. Thank you again to all of our speakers. And we hope to see you again very soon. And all of our British audience, especially, we hope to see you Wednesday at 8 o'clock.